Okay, Matthew chapter 15, and we're picking things up in verse 29. Here's what it says. Jesus went on from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee. And he went up on the mountain and sat down there. And great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put them at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, and the crippled healthy, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they glorified the God of Israel. Okay, so once again, Jesus is out among the crowds, healing people of all kinds of ailments, paralysis, blindness, the inability to speak. But he's doing it now among the Gentiles. We saw this last week when Jesus and his disciples traveled to the Gentile region of Tyre and Sidon and met a Canaanite woman there who demonstrated more faith in Jesus than really any of the disciples have up to this point. And after healing this woman's daughter, Matthew says that Jesus then went on from there and apparently healed many, many more people in this Gentile region for 3 days, in fact, after which we see this happen, beginning in verse 32. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. Okay, so sound familiar, maybe? Right? Seems like we've heard this story before, haven't we? Back in chapter 14, in fact, when we looked at the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And it's true, the two stories are very similar. Both occur in a desolate place. Both stories emphasize the fact that Jesus was moved with compassion toward the crowds. In both stories, Jesus has the disciples give him whatever food they have. He has everybody sit down on the ground both times. He prays a prayer of blessing before handing out the food both times. And he involves the disciples in the miracle both times as well, having them hand out the food and collect the leftovers. So there's a lot of similarities between these two stories, but there's also a few differences. In the first story, they had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and in this story, there are 7 loaves and a few small fish. The size of the crowd is different too. In the first account, 5,000 men are mentioned, plus women and children. And in the second story, the crowd is 4,000 men plus women and children. Also, the first time this happened, the people had been with Jesus an entire day without eating, but this time they were with Jesus for 3 whole days without eating. And of course, the number of leftovers is different too. In the first miracle, the disciples gathered 12 baskets of leftovers, and in the second miracle, they gathered 7 baskets of leftovers. So there's both similarities and differences between these two stories, but the biggest difference is the location. Now, both times this miracle occurs near the Sea of Galilee, but like we already mentioned, this time Jesus and the disciples are on the other side of the sea, the Gentile side of the sea. So the first time, Jesus fed a predominantly Jewish crowd, and this time he's feeding a crowd that is probably made up mostly of Gentiles, and that is a pretty significant difference. At least the disciples seem to think so. If you remember, in the first story, it was the disciples who approached Jesus about the fact that the people were getting hungry and needed to get something to eat. But this time, when confronted with a crowd of hungry Gentiles, the disciples don't say anything for 3 whole days. Jesus is the one who is moved with compassion for this crowd, not the disciples. In fact, he's the one who has to point out the fact that they haven't eaten for 3 days. And the disciples basically respond by saying what? Nothing we can do about it, right? Look at verse 33 again. And the disciples said, where are we going to get enough bread? So the disciples don't seem to be responding with a whole lot of compassion this time for this crowd, not like Jesus is. And not only that, they seem to have a very short memory, don't they? It wasn't that long ago that the disciples saw Jesus feed even more people with hardly any food. So why don't they think he can do it again with this crowd? Especially after Jesus clearly says that he's unwilling to send the people away hungry. That probably should have clued the disciples in on what would happen next. But for whatever reason, the disciples are unable to see that. All they can see is that they don't have enough bread to feed this crowd of Gentiles. Not to mention that they're also unable to see the fact that they happen to be standing right next to a bread maker. And let's be honest, Matthew is deliberately trying to get us to see that. He wants us to see that despite the fact that the disciples not only witnessed but took part in the feeding of the 5,000, they still couldn't see that Jesus was both willing and able to do it again. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. The disciples still don't see things clearly, and that's affecting their faith. Of course, Jesus ends up using the disciples again anyway. Once again, he involves them in this miracle. He uses them to feed the crowd, and once again, they're the ones who collect the leftovers and find that there was more than enough to meet everyone's needs. But Matthew wants us to see this persistent problem that exists among Jesus' disciples. That despite all of the evidence in front of them, they're still unable to see things clearly. And speaking of people who don't see things clearly, take a look at what happens next in chapter 16 and verse 1. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, when it is evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. Okay, so get this. After Jesus feeds the 4,000, he and his disciples get into a boat. They sail across the Sea of Galilee to the region of Megaw, which was a Jewish territory on the western side of the sea. And it's there that they are confronted with another gang of religious leaders, only this time they've joined forces. Right? The Pharisees and Sadducees, they usually didn't get along very well, but now it seems they have a common enemy. And so as soon as Jesus gets off the boat, they come rushing in to disrupt things and try to question Jesus and test Jesus, which, as we'll see in just a minute, ends up with Jesus and the disciples immediately climbing back into the boat to sail across to the other side of the sea again. So if you can picture this, Jesus and the disciples are literally going back and forth across the Sea of Galilee, doing their best to avoid people just like this. Now, at first glance, it looks like Jesus isn't being very patient with the Pharisees and Sadducees. They ask him for something. Jesus basically says, no way, forget that. Turns his back on them, gets back into the boat, and sails away again to the other side. And what side is that? The Gentile side, or more importantly, the side where these guys are not, because Jesus has had enough. Now, to put things into perspective, let's quickly look at how Jesus has responded to the religious leaders up to this point, because he hasn't always treated them this way. If you remember back in chapter 9, when they challenged Jesus' authority to forgive sins, he commanded a paralyzed man to get up and walk as proof for them that he was able to forgive sins. And then when they challenged him on other things, saying, why do you eat with sinners? Or why don't your disciples fast? Or why are you doing work, or what they considered work, on the Sabbath? And Jesus was very patient with them, and he attempted to explain to them why he did these things, but none of his proofs and none of his explanations were ever good enough. To the point that by chapter 12, these religious leaders are conspiring together to figure out a way to have Jesus killed. So now Jesus is like, that's it, man. We're done. Because the truth is, no matter what Jesus does or what he says, these people are not going to believe him anyway. Even after he's in the belly of the earth for 3 days and rises from the dead, which, as we learned back in chapter 12, is what the sign of Jonah is. But not even that will convince them. But see, there's another reason why Jesus doesn't grant the request for a sign, and it has to do with the type of sign that they're asking for. Notice they're not asking Jesus to heal anyone or cast out a demon or feed a multitude of people again with a few loaves and fish. But that's because the Pharisees and Sadducees are asking Jesus not just for a sign, but for a sign from heaven, which is a very specific thing. See, a sign from heaven is something apocalyptic. In other words, it's a sign of the end times and the coming of God's kingdom, which these religious leaders believe points to God's deliverance of Israel and the destruction of her enemies, which include the Gentiles. Which is ironic when you consider the fact that Jesus has just finished feeding over 4,000 Gentiles, which points to God's mercy and grace toward them, not their destruction. And so Jesus isn't going to give these guys a sign from heaven that reinforces their image of a political Messiah that's going to save Israel from the Gentiles. Jesus didn't come to earth to overthrow political tyrants in the world so that he can replace them with a bunch of religious tyrants. And yet that's the kind of Messiah that these guys were waiting for, one that will put them in power. And Jesus knows that, and so of course he's not going to give them what they're asking for. Look, when people say, if God will just show me a sign, then I'll believe in him, no, they won't. They'll believe in a God who does whatever they say, right? Or whatever they want him to. That's what they'll believe in. But that's not God. Jesus will address this again later in chapter 24 when he basically says there's going to be no sign from heaven until it's too late. In other words, when the Son of Man returns on the clouds of heaven in power and great glory, and the sun turns dark and the stars fall from the sky, that'll be your sign, and then it'll be too late. So we should consider how patient Jesus has been with the Pharisees and Sadducees up to this point, and also consider what it is that they're really asking for here before we judge Jesus for getting back into the boat and sailing away from them. Because the spiritual condition of these religious leaders is so far gone that there is absolutely nothing that Jesus can say, there is no sign that he can perform that is going to change their minds. Not even rising from the dead. That's how firmly established they are in their unbelief. But what's even worse than that is that their condition is contagious. Take a look at what happens next. Jesus and his disciples are sailing back across the lake to get away from the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then in verse 5, Matthew says this: when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, "We brought no bread." But Jesus, aware of this, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay, so Jesus has just sailed away from the Pharisees and Sadducees to the other side of the sea, but even though he's left them behind, apparently their infection has followed them onto the boat. And by infection, I'm referring to their toxic unbelief. And we know this is the case because the very first thing Jesus says to his disciples after they get out of the boat is what? Verse 6. Watch out, right? Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, what does Jesus mean by that? Well, leaven, of course, refers to yeast, which we typically don't think of as anything that is bad, right? I mean, yeast usually comes in a harmless-looking little packet, and it's used to make dough rise. I mean, how troubling is that? But see, back then, yeast didn't come in little packets that you could pick up at your local ShopRite. Yeast was something that you made at home yourself. And it was made by keeping back a piece of the dough from a previous batch of bread and then storing it in just the right conditions in order to promote the process of fermentation. The only problem is, if it wasn't done right, if it wasn't done correctly, the yeast could easily become spoiled, and then that spoiled yeast would infect the next batch of dough. And so what Jesus tells his disciples, when he tells them to watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, that's what he's talking about. He's comparing the toxic unbelief of these religious leaders to spoiled yeast that has the potential to infect an entire batch of dough, which is really scary when you think about it. That Jesus' own disciples, who are spending 24 hours a day with him, are in danger of being infected by the same kind of toxic unbelief that causes these religious leaders to conspire together to kill Jesus. And when you think about who else is in the boat, namely Judas, you can see how dangerous this is and how susceptible the disciples really are to this infection. And how do they respond to this warning? I mean, this is a pretty big deal, right? So how did the disciples respond to this? Verse 7. We didn't bring any bread. What? This is why unbelief is so dangerous. When we're infected by it, we don't even know that we are. And there is nothing more dangerous than an infection that you don't know you have. Because if you don't know you have it, then you're not going to bother to seek any treatment for it. Which is why Jesus is saying to his disciples, watch out, open your eyes, pay attention, this is dangerous stuff. And the disciples are like, anybody got any bread? Like, they don't see it, they don't see the danger. And so to help the disciples see their condition a little more clearly, Jesus starts asking them some questions, right? 5 questions to be exact. And they're rhetorical questions because the answers are pretty obvious. Why are you talking about bread? Don't you see? Don't you perceive? Don't you remember about the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets of leftovers you had? And the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many leftovers you had? How is it that you fail to understand that I'm not talking about bread? Why are you even concerned about that? But see, that's what unbelief does. It prevents us from seeing things clearly, to the point where we can know a lot of things about a lot of stuff, including things that are true about Jesus, but not necessarily understand how those things relate to us. For instance, you may understand, you may know from this story even, that Jesus was full of compassion for people, but not understand his compassion for you. Or you may know that Jesus is capable of meeting people's needs, but not understand how that relates to your needs. See, the disciples knew that Jesus could feed thousands of people with next to nothing. They just couldn't see how that was going to help them with their need. Oh my gosh, we don't have any bread. What are we going to do? And so what we see from this story is that it's the people with the most knowledge, whether it's knowledge from the scriptures like the religious leaders had, or knowledge of the teachings and works of Jesus like the disciples had. It's people who are the most in the know that are in the most danger when it comes to unbelief. You'd think it's just the opposite, right? But it's not. I mean, we just saw this last week. Who possessed more knowledge about Jesus? The disciples who were with him 24/7? Or the Canaanite woman who just met Jesus for the very first time? And then, who demonstrated more faith? She did, right? And so when Matthew takes that story of a Gentile woman who Jesus had, quote, great faith, and immediately follows it up with this story of the disciples' quote, little faith, do you think Matthew maybe is trying to show us something? That maybe it's those of us who think we know more who really need to be on guard. How likely is it that we could be so confident in what we know to be true that we think we couldn't possibly be in danger of being deceived? It reminds me of a passage in 1 Corinthians 8 where the Apostle Paul says this: if anyone imagines that he knows something, he doesn't yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. See, there's a difference between just knowing things that are true about God and being known by God. And that difference affects the way that we apply the knowledge that we do have. See, there's a difference between just reading God's word and letting God's word read you. It's the difference between possessing knowledge, which by itself can lead to pride and unbelief, and possessing a relationship with God, which produces humility and faith. And here's the thing. It's not that the disciples didn't have that relationship with Jesus. They did. They just forgot that they did. And when that happens, when we lose sight of the relationship we have with Jesus, that's when unbelief can begin to creep in. And when that happens, it prevents us from seeing things clearly, to the point that it's actually possible to worry about not having enough bread to eat when you're sharing a boat with a bread maker. Now, I got to be honest. When I read a passage like this one, where the disciples just seem to be completely clueless, especially when you consider everything that they've heard from Jesus up until this point and what they've seen him do right in front of them, I'll be honest, the temptation is to look at myself and say, well, at least I'm not that clueless, right? At least I know who Jesus is and what he's done and what he's still willing and able to do until, of course, I'm not. And I think of all the times when Jesus has had to say the same thing to me over and over and over again, because I forget about the reality of my relationship with him and let the toxic unbelief of the world infect my faith, and either cause me to worry about things that I shouldn't be worried about, or paralyze me from accomplishing the things that Jesus has called me to do, or the person he's called me to become. Now, this may seem like a low note to end on, but that's not a bad thing. Sometimes low is where we need to be. It's when we're overly confident in what we know and put our trust in what we know or what we think we know. That's when we're really in danger of not seeing things clearly. And that's when we're the most susceptible to the infection of unbelief. The truth is this: the more we grow in our knowledge of God, the more important it is for us to remember that we never outgrow our need for the cross. Remember again the Canaanite woman from last week. It's in the place of humility and surrender that faith is found. And that's where change is found, where healing and deliverance and freedom is found. As we begin to see clearly who Jesus is and worship him.